Today is Wednesday, Parashat Metzora. We are getting closer and closer to Passover, and we'll continue what we started yesterday of explaining the step-by-step order of the Seder night. The holiday of Passover begins with this dinner that is so well organized and that has these 15 steps that have been observed for centuries and centuries and have done so much to preserve our identity and our experience as Jews from generation to generation as we go through these steps of the Seder and as we tell the story of the Exodus. We're actually giving ourselves and our children and our grandchildren a memorable experience that stays with them for their whole lifetime and really does a lot to preserve our identity as Jews and to reinforce who we are and our relationship with Hashem. But it's done as a step-by-step order, 15 steps of the Passover Seder. Yesterday we explained the Kiddush. Today we go to the next step, Urchatz. What is Urchatz? We wash our hands without saying a bracha because we're about to dip a karpas, which is vegetables, into a liquid. And anytime you dip a vegetable into a liquid, you need to first wash your hands before you do that. So that's Urchatz. Then Karpas. Karpas, we take some celery. In our tradition, it's celery, and we dip it in water and salt or vinegar. Very symbolic. The water and salt represents the tears that the Jewish people shed as they were so made to suffer under the taskmasters in the slavery in Egypt. So this is to remind us, before we even start talking about the salvation and the Exodus and the freedom, we start for what did we start with? It was a dark time in Egypt. It was a time of suffering, of tears, and we dip it in the water and salt or in vinegar. Karpas is celery. Why specifically karpas? Many reasons that are given why specifically celery, but I'll share with you one idea that is brought by the commentators. The word karpas in Hebrew means parsley, but it means also a beautiful garment. And he makes allusion to the garment that Yaakov Avinu made for his son Joseph. It was a beautiful tunic, colorful one, and his brothers were jealous. And the jealousy got to such an extent that they sold their brother Yosef as a slave to be sent to Egypt. They sold him to the Ishmaelim. And the tunic that he was wearing, they dipped it in the blood of a goat and sent it back to their father, pretending that he was devoured by a wild animal. That kind of hatred or jealousy between brothers that even brought these brothers to sell Yosef as a slave was the beginning of a succession of events that ended up with all his family, his brothers and his father and all of his immediate family, actually all his family, to be in Egypt, and started a succession of events that eventually led to the Jewish people being slaves in Egypt. So before we start the whole Seder, and before we start the celebration of Passover, and before we go through all the 15 steps, we hear now the third step, according to this explanation of some commentators. Let us remember that the whole problem started because of hatred between brothers and the sale of Yosef as a slave, and that is something horrible that happened, but it's something to teach us that we have to be very careful with jealousy, very careful with how we relate to each other. By the way, even with Yosef, he was sold, but actually the problem started when he spoke slanderous speech about his brothers to their father, and that's also another aspect that we have to be careful about. Lashon hara, be careful about slanderous speech. Be careful about jealousy. Be careful about all those things, because those can bring about, as a succession of events, the horrible things that happened when the Jewish people were slaves in Egypt. So as we start the Seder, we dipped at Karpas. Again, Karpas is mentioned in the Megillah, referring to some beautiful garments. When Rashi explains what is Ketonet Pasim, that Yaakov bought for his, or that he gave as a gift to his son Yosef, Ketonet Pasim, Rashi explains Karpas. It's a beautiful garment. So we take the garment, dip it in the water and salt, representing that tunic of that garment of Yosef that was dipped in the blood of the goat, to sort of pretend that he was devoured by a wild animal. And that's what they told the father. But that's the idea. The idea is, before we start the celebration, let's remember something that happened that brought about the succession of events that ended up with the slavery in Egypt. So that's the third step of the Seder, and we'll continue tomorrow with the following steps. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen ve'Amen.